Before we begin, understand this. On this channel, we don't speculate. We don't dramatize fiction. Every story you hear is real, documented, and confined to a single moment inside an American prison, told slowly, carefully, and without sensational shortcuts. If you're here for surface-level crime content, this is not that channel. But if you want to understand what it actually feels like inside locked institutions when control disappears, you're in the right place. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications. Because the stories we tell don't repeat, and once they begin, there's no way out until the end. Now, let's go inside. At 3:19 a.m., the men inside California Medical Facility in Vacaville were asleep. Or at least, they were trying to be. Sleep inside a prison is never deep. It is a fragile state, constantly interrupted by metal doors clanging shut, guards' boots echoing down concrete tiers, distant shouts, the hum of fluorescent lights that never truly go dark. But on this night in August 2014, the prison had settled into one of its rare moments of relative quiet. The housing unit was dimly lit, bathed in institutional yellow light. Rows of steel bunks lined the concrete floor, separated by narrow walkways just wide enough for a guard to pass. Men lay on thin mattresses, some facing the wall, others staring upward, counting the hours until morning count. No one inside California Medical Facility knew that, miles beneath the prison's foundation, pressure had been building for decades. At 3:20 a.m., the pressure released. At first, it felt like nothing. A low vibration. Subtle. Almost easy to ignore. Some inmates thought it was heavy machinery outside the fence line. Others assumed it was a large vehicle passing too close to the compound. In prison, unexplained noises are common, and often safer to ignore. Then the vibration grew teeth. The concrete floor shuddered violently beneath the bunks. Lockers rattled. Metal frames screeched against cement. Overhead lights flickered, then went dark. In an instant, the housing unit was thrown into near-total darkness, illuminated only by faint emergency lighting and moonlight filtering through narrow reinforced windows. Men sat upright in their bunks. Some froze. Others shouted. Within seconds, the entire unit was awake. This was not a normal disturbance. This was not routine. The building itself was moving. The ground bucked hard enough to throw inmates off their bunks. Personal property crashed to the floor. Shelves tore loose from walls. A deep, rolling roar, like an approaching freight train, echoed through the unit as the earthquake intensified. Inside prison, fear spreads faster than fire. Men began yelling questions that had no answers. What's happening? Is this an attack? Is the building coming down? Guards were nowhere to be seen. California Medical Facility houses thousands of inmates, many with medical and mental health conditions. In this housing unit, confusion and panic compounded instantly. Some inmates dropped to the floor, covering their heads instinctively. Others staggered through the aisles, disoriented by the darkness and violent shaking. The walls cracked. Not metaphorically. Physically. Hairline fractures split across concrete surfaces that had stood untouched for decades. Dust fell from the ceiling, filling the air with a chalky haze. The emergency alarms failed to activate. The intercom system was dead. For the men trapped inside, the absence of information was terrifying. They had no idea how strong the earthquake was. No idea how long it would last. No idea if help was coming. Outside the unit, the prison itself was in chaos. The 6.0 magnitude South Napa earthquake had struck with enough force to damage buildings across Northern California. At CMF Vacaville, power outages rippled through the compound. Electronic locks failed in some areas and remained sealed in others. Radios crackled with overlapping transmissions as correctional officers tried to assess damage while ensuring inmates remained secured. Inside the housing unit, the shaking reached its peak. Metal bunks slammed against each other. A television mounted high on the wall tore free and smashed onto the floor. Somewhere in the darkness, an inmate screamed, not in anger, but in pure, uncontrolled fear. This was the moment when prison hierarchy dissolved. Gang affiliations didn't matter. Sentence length didn't matter. Reputation didn't matter. All that mattered was survival. Some inmates shouted for guards. Others banged on cell doors, fists striking steel again and again, desperate for acknowledgement. A few men attempted to pray aloud, their voices trembling as the building convulsed around them. 30 seconds felt like 10 minutes. When the shaking finally began to subside, it did not end cleanly. The aftershocks rolled through the unit in waves, each one sending a fresh jolt of panic through men who had already reached their limit. Silence followed. An unnatural silence. The kind that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. Dust hung in the air. Emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows across the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, faint, far beyond the prison walls. Inside the housing unit, men waited. For guards. For instructions. For the next shock. But none came. Minutes passed with no response. No announcements. No reassurance. No visible authority. In prison, order depends on control. On predictability. On the certainty that someone, somewhere, is in charge. That certainty was gone. As inmates began to process what had just happened, a new fear crept in, quieter, but far more dangerous. If the building had been damaged. If the locks had failed. If guards were injured or overwhelmed. What would happen next? This was no longer just an earthquake. This was the beginning of something far more unstable. And inside California Medical Facility, Vacaville, the ground was no longer the only thing that had cracked. The shaking had stopped. But inside California Medical Facility, Vacaville, nothing felt stable anymore. In the seconds after the earthquake subsided, the men inside the housing unit remained frozen in place. Some stood barefoot on cold concrete. Others stayed seated on their bunks, hands clenched so tightly their knuckles whitened. A few hadn't moved at all, curled instinctively on the floor where they dropped during the worst of the shaking. No one spoke at first. The silence that followed was heavier than the quake itself. In prison, silence usually means control, a count being taken, an order about to be shouted, boots approaching down the tier. But this silence was different. It carried uncertainty. It carried absence. There were no guards in sight. The emergency lighting remained weak and uneven, casting long, warped shadows that stretched across the unit like bars within bars. Dust still drifted slowly through the air, settling on bunks, faces, and clothes. The smell of concrete and insulation hung thick in the atmosphere. Men waited for commands that didn't come. Seconds passed. Then a minute. And then another. In that gap, that vacuum where authority should have been, the prison's internal power dynamics began to surface. Inside any housing unit, especially one like this, hierarchy is always present. It doesn't disappear just because the lights go out. Some men are watched. Others are followed. Some speak, and others listen. On a normal day, those dynamics operate quietly, restrained by routine and supervision. But this was not a normal day. This was a moment where no one knew who was in charge anymore. A voice broke the silence from the far end of the unit. "Anyone see staff?" No answer. Another voice followed, louder, sharper. "They ain't coming." That statement landed hard. Men exchanged looks across the rows of bunks. The idea that guards might be injured, trapped, or overwhelmed outside the unit began to spread, not as confirmed fact, but as possibility. And in prison, possibility is enough. A few inmates moved cautiously into the aisles, testing the boundaries of this new, uncertain moment. Their movements were slow at first, deliberate. They weren't running. They weren't acting out. They were assessing. One man, heavily tattooed, his arms marked with years of ink and scar tissue, stepped forward and peered toward the control booth. The glass was dark. No silhouette behind it. No radio chatter. No movement. That detail mattered. In prison, the control booth is the symbol of oversight. If it's dark, it means something is wrong. As whispers began to ripple through the unit, fear morphed into something else. Opportunity. Not the reckless kind, not yet, but the kind born from uncertainty. Men began talking quietly in pairs and small clusters. Some speculated about the damage to the facility. Others wondered if doors had unlocked elsewhere. A few discussed whether this was temporary, or the beginning of something bigger. But beneath all of it was a shared realization. For the first time in years, the system had blinked. California Medical Facility houses a wide range of inmates, long-term prisoners, chronically ill men, individuals with mental health diagnoses. In moments of stress, reactions vary wildly. Some inmates began pacing, unable to stay still. Others laughed nervously, adrenaline leaking out in bursts. A few shouted into the darkness, calling out names, trying to locate friends or cellmates. One man started banging on a wall. Not violently. Rhythmically. A steady, echoing knock that traveled through the concrete structure. It wasn't a threat. It was a test. A signal. Still no response. As minutes stretched on, the absence of staff became impossible to ignore. Guards were trained for emergencies, but earthquakes introduce a level of chaos that overrides even the most rehearsed protocols. Power systems had failed. Radios were unreliable. Movement across the compound was restricted while damage assessments were attempted. Inside the housing unit, none of that mattered. What mattered was perception. And the perception was that the men inside had been left alone. That perception changed everything. One inmate, older, quieter, someone who had spent enough time inside to recognize danger before it announced itself, pulled himself up onto his bunk and scanned the room. He wasn't looking for exits. He was watching people. Who was moving? Who was talking? Who was watching guards that weren't there? He understood what many didn't yet: this moment could turn fast. Prison order depends on immediate response. A shout answered by authority. A rule enforced the moment it's tested. Without that, tension doesn't dissipate, it compounds. Another aftershock hit. Smaller than the first, but enough to jolt the building and send a fresh wave of panic through the unit. Several inmates shouted. One fell to his knees. The lights flickered again, threatening to go out entirely. That was the breaking point for some. A group of inmates surged toward the center aisle, voices raised now, overlapping. They gotta let us out. This place ain't safe. If this comes down, we die in here. Fear had turned outward. Not yet violent, but no longer contained. Men began pushing past each other, abandoning bunks, crowding toward doors and control points. Others pulled back, instinctively sensing that proximity to chaos was dangerous. Prison experience teaches one lesson above all: when things go bad, distance keeps you alive. Still no guards. Some inmates began speculating aloud that parts of the prison had collapsed. That staff were injured. That emergency response teams were dealing with fires or fallen walls elsewhere. None of it was confirmed. But in that darkness, rumor carried as much weight as fact. A man near the rear of the unit, younger, visibly shaken, began crying. Not loudly. Just enough to be noticed. Another inmate put a hand on his shoulder, steadying him, whispering something unheard. This moment, this strange blend of fear, solidarity, and menace, revealed something rarely seen by the outside world. Prisoners are not a single emotion. They are fear and aggression. Solidarity and self-preservation. Calm calculation and raw panic. And when the system falters, all of it surfaces at once. Eventually, finally, a voice crackled faintly over a handheld radio near the unit entrance. Indistinct. Broken. Unclear. But it was enough. Head snapped toward the sound. A guard appeared at the far end of the unit, partially silhouetted by emergency lighting. His posture was rigid. His expression unreadable from a distance. He was alone. That detail mattered, too. One guard meant the situation was still unstable. He raised his voice, ordering inmates to return to their bunks, to remain calm, to await further instructions. The words were standard. Procedural. But the tone lacked confidence. The men could hear it. Some complied immediately, retreating to their bunks, eager to disappear back into invisibility. Others hesitated, weighing their options. A few challenged the orders verbally, shouting questions the guard couldn't answer. How bad is it? Are we safe? What if it hits again? The guard didn't respond. He couldn't. Because he didn't know either. That uncertainty, shared between staff and inmates alike, was the most dangerous element of the night. As additional officers began arriving sporadically, trying to reassert control, the housing unit settled into a tense standoff. No one knew whether the earthquake was over. No one knew whether the building was structurally sound. No one knew how the rest of the prison had fared. But everyone understood one thing clearly. The illusion of absolute control had been shattered. And once inmates realize that control is not guaranteed, it changes how they see the system forever. This earthquake didn't just crack walls. It exposed fault lines in authority, trust, and power, fault lines that would shape everything that happened next. The second aftershock hit like a punch to the ribs. Men who had been frozen in place during the first quake were now propelled into motion. Bunks tipped. Personal property clattered to the floor. Dust filled the air, mingling with the metallic tang of fear and sweat. Voices rose in a cacophony, shouting, panicked questions, frantic commands. Get down. Hold on. Call the guards. Emergency lights flickered violently, plunging parts of the housing unit into near darkness. Shadows stretched across cracked concrete walls, creating distorted shapes that made each movement feel threatening. Men stumbled through narrow aisles, colliding with bunks, lockers, and each other. Every crash reverberated off the concrete, amplifying panic. The first confrontation occurred without premeditation. Two inmates collided in a tight aisle, one knocking into the other in an instinctive reaction to the shaking. Fists flew before words could be spoken. The impact of the bodies, metal, and furniture sent a cascade of debris into the unit's already tense atmosphere. Others nearby froze for a moment, assessing, calculating, then either moved to intervene or seized the opportunity to assert dominance. Prison hierarchy, usually so rigid, dissolved instantly. Age, gang affiliation, and reputation mattered less than strength and fear. Younger inmates panicked, pressing themselves against walls, clutching bunk frames. Older, hardened prisoners moved with purpose, weaving through chaos to find safe ground, sometimes helping others, sometimes exploiting the panic. A man with a jagged cheek scar stood on a tipped-over bunk, voice cutting through the din. Everyone calmed down. But authority was meaningless here. The quake had stripped the unit of control. His words went mostly unheard, drowned by shouts and the shaking of metal. Inmates challenged him, pushing back, asserting their own influence over the rapidly shifting social order. Another aftershock rolled through the unit, smaller than the first, but enough to reignite panic. Men screamed. Several fell to the floor. Dust rained from ceiling cracks. Electrical conduits sparked briefly, illuminating terrified faces in harsh bursts of light. Minor injuries began to appear. One inmate slipped on the wet concrete, head striking a bunk frame. Another cut his hand on fallen debris. But instinct for survival overrode concern for wounds. Every man's attention was fixed on immediate danger, shaking floors, falling objects, and unpredictable fellow inmates. Clusters of inmates began forming their own micro-hierarchies. One older man, respected within the prison's unofficial pecking order, moved deliberately through the unit, signaling groups to stabilize near sturdier bunks and away from hazards. Some followed. Many did not. Fear and aggression intermingled, creating an unstable environment where calm and chaos existed side by side. Panic fueled further minor conflicts. A younger inmate, tripping over debris, collided with another. A shove became a push became a grab. Metal scraped concrete. Shouts escalated. Hands, tattoos glistening with sweat, gripped bunk posts defensively. Everyone in the aisle had to react quickly or risk injury. From the far end of the unit, a faint cry for help echoed, an inmate trapped under a toppled locker. Several men rushed to assist, moving cautiously yet urgently, balancing fear with instinctive solidarity. These bursts of cooperation were brief and localized. Moments later, the fear-driven chaos resumed, punctuated by trembling screams, falling debris, and shaking walls. The lone guard at the front of the unit faced an impossible task. He shouted orders to return to bunks, to stay down, to protect themselves. Some complied. Others ignored him entirely. A few shouted back questions he could not answer. Are we safe? We're going to die in here. He had no answers. No one did. Time stretched. Minutes became eternal. Every tremor reset the panic. Every scream, every clash of bodies or metal, reignited adrenaline. The unit had become a volatile arena, a place where survival instincts overrode established hierarchy. In the center, a small group of inmates began to assert temporary order. Older, experienced prisoners signaled others to huddle near stable bunks, away from loose furniture or falling debris. They whispered instructions, guided the young or frightened, and in subtle ways prevented some confrontations from escalating. It was fragile control, but it was the first glimmer of order in the chaos. By now, several inmates had cuts, bruises, or minor lacerations. Yet the true danger wasn't the injuries themselves, it was the psychological instability. Panic and fear, in confined spaces like this, spread faster than fire. One misstep could spark violence that even the returning officers might struggle to contain. Finally, the first group of guards arrived in earnest. Their presence brought a tense, uneven authority. Orders were shouted. Some inmates obeyed immediately, retreating to bunks. Others resisted, still unsure of whether the building itself or the returning officers were the more pressing danger. The aftershocks continued, sporadic but unnerving. The housing unit, physically intact for the most part, had undergone an internal upheaval more dangerous than structural damage. The quake had revealed fault lines in human behavior, hierarchy dissolved, fear spread uncontrollably, and moments of solidarity were fleeting and tactical. As emergency procedures began to take hold, and inmates were directed to safer areas, the realization sank in, the illusion of absolute control inside California Medical Facility had been shattered. For the first time, prisoners understood that authority was not guaranteed, that panic could spread, and that the system's structure, built over decades, could falter. In a unit designed for containment, the earthquake had created unpredictability. Survival depended not on loyalty, not on reputation, not on past compliance, but on perception, reaction, and instinct. By the time partial order returned, men were exhausted, bruised, and shaken to their core. Some huddled on bunks. Others paced slowly, still wary of aftershocks. The guard's voice, finally supported by reinforcements, provided structure again, but only externally. Inside, the unit had been irrevocably altered. This earthquake had done more than crack concrete. It had cracked the fragile veneer of order, exposing the raw, unpredictable human reactions that lie beneath. And the next stage, injuries, fear, and the aftermath of this chaos, would test the prison's ability to contain both the building and its inhabitants. By the time dawn approached, the worst of the aftershocks had finally faded. Inside the housing unit at California Medical Facility in Vacaville, the air was still thick with dust and exhaustion. Men sat on bunks that had been pushed back into place, some clutching makeshift bandages, others staring forward in silence. The chaos of the night had burned itself out, leaving behind something quieter, but heavier. Fear doesn't disappear when danger ends. It settles. Correctional officers now filled the unit in greater numbers. Their presence was firm, methodical, and restrained. Flashlights swept across cracked walls and damaged fixtures. Officers conducted head counts slowly, carefully, calling out names and waiting for responses. Any inmate who didn't answer immediately drew attention. A few men were escorted out for medical evaluation. Cuts. Bruises. Possible concussions. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to leave visible reminders of how close the night had come to spiraling further. Others were instructed to remain seated while maintenance teams assessed structural damage. The building had held. But barely. Hairline fractures snaked along the concrete walls. Ceiling panels sagged where anchors had loosened. Electrical systems remained unstable, forcing reliance on emergency lighting. The unit was declared temporarily secure, but not untouched. For inmates, the realization set in slowly. They had survived something none of them had trained for. Prison is built around predictability. Count times. Movement schedules. Clear chains of command. The earthquake shattered all of that in seconds. For nearly half an hour, there had been no certainty, only instinct, fear, and reaction. And every man in that unit knew it. In the days that followed, the administration conducted internal reviews. Procedures were examined. Emergency response times were scrutinized. Staff were debriefed. The official language would later describe the incident as controlled despite complications. Inside the housing unit, the language was different. Men spoke quietly about who panicked. Who helped. Who nearly lost control. Reputations shifted. An inmate who had calmed others during the worst moments earned respect that no sentence length could grant. Another who had lashed out in fear found himself watched more closely. The earthquake didn't erase the prison hierarchy, it rewrote parts of it. Trust, once broken, didn't fully return. Lights flickering at night now drew attention. A loud noise caused heads to turn. A sudden vibration, machinery, trucks, distant movement, made men sit up in their bunks. The building stood the same. The mindset inside it did not. For the officers, the night left its own mark. They had been reminded that control is not absolute. That uniforms and procedures don't stop the ground from moving. That in moments like these, authority depends as much on human presence as policy. California Medical Facility returned to routine within days. Meals resumed. Counts resumed. Work assignments resumed. But something lingered beneath the surface. Because once inmates experience a moment where the system falters, where doors stay closed, lights go out, and orders don't come, the illusion of permanence is gone. They now knew the truth. Prison walls are strong. Prison systems are not infallible. And control, no matter how rigid it seems, can fracture without warning. That night, the earthquake didn't cause a riot. It didn't collapse the building. It didn't lead to mass escape. What it did was quieter, and more lasting. It exposed how thin the line is between order and chaos. How quickly fear can override structure. And how, in confined spaces, survival depends not on rules, but on people. For the men inside that housing unit, August 2014 would never be remembered as just an earthquake. It was the night the ground moved. And the system moved with it. When people think of prison danger, they imagine violence between inmates, riots, or escapes. They rarely imagine the ground itself becoming the threat. But inside locked institutions, emergencies don't just test buildings, they test control, psychology, and human behavior under pressure. The men inside California medical facility didn't know how strong the earthquake was. They didn't know if help was coming. They didn't know if the walls would hold. And for a brief window of time, neither did the system holding them. This story isn't about destruction. It's about vulnerability. Because when nature intervenes, prisons lose their greatest weapon, predictability. And once that disappears, everything changes. If you want more real, documented stories from inside America's most controlled environments, subscribe. These moments don't repeat. And once they begin, there's no way out until the end.